every industry has standards. For example, the motion picture camera, there are two or three film formats with a number of sprockets, a speed, a shooting speed that's standard. If you didn't have that, then some motion pictures would play back too slowly and people would talk very slowly and it would be bizarre. Okay. Our industry started with, in the absence of those standards. We had HTML, but it wasn't really supported correctly in any browser. And browser makers initially led the exciting adoption of the web. So if Netscape added a feature, every web developer learned it, and we all used it, and it wasn't a standard, but that's okay. And then Microsoft, to compete, added a feature, and it wasn't supported in Netscape's browser. So what ended up happening was that in order to make even just a simple content website, you ended up having to make 3 or 4 different versions of every page. And this is back in the 90s when websites weren't doing very much. They were pretty much static pieces of content with maybe a form where you could get more, sign up to a mailing list. And yet you were making all these different versions. And if you had even a very simple JavaScript, for instance, to validate the form, you had to write it 4 different ways for IE3, IE4, Netscape 3, Netscape 4. So some colleagues and I, in 1998, started the Web Standards Project to basically ask browser makers to comply with a very small group of standards that would work across all devices, and they eventually did, and today all browsers support them pretty well. As for what standards are and why they're important, in addition to not spending 25% of your time and 25% of your budget making all these different versions of a site, and that's money you can either save if you don't have a lot of money, or money you could put into better writers, proofreaders, editors, filmmakers, better design, better original illustration. It's money you could spend in better ways than just making multiple versions. The most findable content is content that is designed with web standards and structured that way. And when we started the Web Standards Project, we didn't know that, because when we started it, nobody used Google. Google didn't really exist. Google existed as sort of a project by 2 graduate students. And people used to find web content either by reading your print ad and going, oh, look, there's a web address, and typing it in, right, dutifully, and going to your homepage. Or they went to Yahoo, which had a hierarchical index, right, of all the content on the web, and they go, I'm looking for porn. How would I find porn? And then they would type social and cultural. That must be it. And then they'd sort of drill their way down to the porn. Whereas with Google, they would just type porn or whatever they were looking for and find it. But Google didn't exist at the time, so we didn't know that we were creating a means of designing websites that would make content very easy to find. But that is a great benefit of it. And when I talk to business people about this, if I talk about semantics, their eyes glaze over. But if I talk about your content will be found on Google, they get it and they like that. So most blogs that I know about are now designed with web standards. Some very large commercial sites are designed with web standards. ESPN was an early adopter of web standards. Wired.com was an early adopter of web standards. Seed magazine just had a redesign by Tim Murtaugh and Mike Pick. It's beautiful, and you look at it and think you're looking at Flash content because of the way things move around and all, but it's all web standards. There's Flash is used for the custom video player, but everything else is XHTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And when my friends and I were pushing for web standards in the 90s, people laughed at us because if you're designers, don't you want to use Flash? If you're a designer, why don't you just make an image of the text? If you're, and we really felt like losers. We felt, and we would say, well, when we would say, someone would do a site one way and they'd say, it looks the same in every browser. And I'd say, well, mine doesn't look exactly the same in an old browser, but that's okay, it still works. People thought I was a bad designer, they made fun of me, and my friends who felt the same way, but we won, which is kind of amazing. Just, I don't know how, but now most of the Web 2.0 sites that you hear about use web standards. Web standards have really won, and they've really captured a hold of most of the interesting web content on, the personal sites, the blogs, the social networking apps, the Web 2.0 sites. But even if you look at, I just did a test, just a simple validation test of the top 100, Alexa's top 100 U.S. sites to see how many validated, and 7 validated, and 2 almost did. These are sites like Apple.com, and but if you look under the surface and see what they're doing, they're all using CSS for layout. They're all using semantic markup. Sometimes the CMS breaks the validation. Sometimes they don't bother. Everybody's sort of on. Everybody who knows what they're doing in web development and web design is now pretty much on board this train, even though not everyone is purist and not everyone shares exactly the same understanding. Is web standards an ethos? It is, although for someone who's looked at as leading the movement, I'm very undoctrinaire. I got involved out of practical concerns. I basically didn't want to learn. I didn't want to learn more than 4 kinds of JavaScript, 8 kinds of JavaScript. It just seemed crazy. I really thought I wanted to spend more time on design and writing and content strategy, usability, stuff like that. So to me, this was always practical, and I think if I hadn't, and my colleagues, most of my colleagues in the Web Standards Project, hadn't had that sort of practical mindset, I don't think it would have taken off. I think if we'd said you should do this because you should do it, and if you don't do it, you're a bad person, that's religion, and there are definitely people in web standards who are religious. There are people who say if your site doesn't validate, then it's not standards compliant, or it wasn't designed with web standards. If you make efforts to be accessible, but you don't meet every requirement of this particular standard or this particular specification, then you're not really doing it right. I try not to do that. I always think, design, like everything in life, is about understanding what the problems are, solving those problems, and there's always trade-offs. When we design a site, we have to understand who the users are, and we have to design with the lead users and maybe 3 other kinds in mind. And there may be someone who's an edge case who the site will work for them, but it isn't optimal for them. That's just a trade-off. Or you use the means at your disposal to size type. You want to size type in such a way that it's readable and looks good for most people, but people can still come in and change the size if they want to, because it's the web. There are different ways of doing that, and there's no perfect way. If I use a relative font size so people using Internet Explorer can make it bigger or smaller, then someone who's set their default to 11 points is going to find that my website the type is too small, and they'll say, I fail to understand how, as a supposed professional, you could make such small type. But if I do it using pixels, then people in Internet Explorer can't resize it, at least, And so it's always trade-offs, and it's always, I do think it's an ethos. I think it's a point of view, and that you should, and most people who work with web standards eventually internalize them in their design practice. But nothing is the be-all and end-all. A good user experience is, good content, well presented. That's the be-all and end-all. That's the real ethos. And these are just tools and techniques.